this whole year I've been going down this list of terms, these kind of these key terms within the Soto Zen tradition. And I've been saving one up for no reason other than a kind of like sometimes on my plate, if there's something I'm really looking forward to eating, I don't eat it first. And so I'll kind of give it a little bit of space to breathe, and I'll eat the peas first, and then I'll eat something, and then I finally get to whatever that is. And we're not at the end of the list, but I looked at the list and I thought, okay, I'm not going to delay this anymore. I love this one. So the term is Kesa Kudoku. Kesa is the robe. It's this robe. If you're wearing a rakusu, it's that robe. Kudoku means merit. And like many of these terms, it doubles as the title of one of the fascicles of Dogen's Shobogenzo. There's Kesa Kudoku. There are two critical texts about the robe by Dogen. The first one is called Denne, and Denne means the transmission of the robe. And the second is Kesa Kudoku, which goes into the virtue or the merit of the robe. And it would be fun to spend a lot of time with that text because it goes into a lot of things. Not only this idea of the merit itself, but about how to take care of a robe. That there are ways that you wash a robe, for example, and you do it with flower petals. There are ways that you touch a robe. There are places you do put a robe and don't put a robe. You would never put anything on top of a robe, except maybe another robe. So there's a closet here in the temple where I have a stack, and there might be a few robes stacked, but there will never be anything on the top of that stack that isn't another robe, because this is considered a sacred object. It has a special place. When in a monastery, when you go to the washroom, you take this robe off before you go in, and then you take this robe off because this is the thing that touches this. And so neither one goes into the washroom. So there's this feeling about something pure. And we take care of it as if it's something pure that we have to keep pure. And I want to give you just a taste. This isn't from Dogen directly, but we chant this thing when we're sewing. It's called the 10 excellent merits of the kasaya. The kasaya that's Sanskrit for the robe. I won't read the whole thing, though it is wonderful. And if you've ever sewn with me, you've received this text. I just want to give a sense of the scope of the merit according to this tradition. Dharma attire fends off social shame, but it fills us with the humility that produces a field of happiness. So there's this very kind of mundane, tangible thing that it does. It just makes you more comfortable. But then it also imbues you with a humility that is the humility that reveals the joy of the Dharma. It keeps away cold and heat and poisonous insects. So it's more than just a layer. It's a kind of shield. Firming our will to the truth, it enables us to arrive at the ultimate. And again, if we think about this as like advertising language, you're saying not only does it protect you from poisonous insects, it also enables you to arrive at the ultimate. It manifests the form of a monk, and I've mentioned this one before, that the robe is actually first. The robe appears, and then a monk appears within it. But there's no monk without the robe. It manifests the form of a monk and keeps away greed. It eradicates the 5 views and promotes right practice. And then we get into this incredible language that we will recognize if we have read Universal Gateway, that chapter of the Lotus Sutra. If a dragon wears a single strand of the kasaya, it will escape the fate of becoming food for a garuda. A garuda is this huge bird that eats dragons. One strand. If people retain this robe when crossing the ocean, they need not fear trouble from dragonfish or demons. We recognize this language. When thunder roars, lightning strikes, and the sky is angry, someone who wears the kasaya is fearless. And in all three of these, when we read Universal Gateway, instead of the reference to the robe, there's this reference to compassion, which is itself originally an appeal to Avalokiteshvara. That if thunder roars and lightning strikes and you appeal to this pure compassion, you'll be fine. And then there's this other voice in the tradition saying that if thunder roars and lightning strikes, if you just have this, you'll be fine. And when we start to see that overlap, that we're doing the same thing and we're using a different subject in the sentence, that's a clue to how this tradition is working. I want to have the space, and I would like to frame this as a selfless wish, but it's a pretty selfish wish. I want to have the space to talk with all of you about the robes in incredible detail for hours. Because this part of the tradition has come to matter so much to me. It has become for me an entryway to faith, I think, in exactly the way that it was intended. But rather than getting to all the details, and maybe one day we'll get to do that, I want to talk instead about that entryway to faith and how it works. There's all this language, and it goes back more than 800 years, but we really start to feel it with Dogen, because Dogen had this moment. He had a moment when he was in China. Now, he was already a monk when he arrived there. He was already fully ordained. He had been wearing robes for years. And he traveled across China and he visited different temples and he visited different teachers. And again, he's wearing robes the whole time. He's encountering people who are wearing robes the whole time. And at one point during his stay in his teacher's temple, probably very early, because this would have been part of their regular ritual, they were doing zazen, and then everybody starts chanting the robe verse. How great the robe of liberation, a formless field of merit. Wrapping ourselves in Buddha's teaching, we free all beings. And they chant this 3 times, very slowly. And if you've sewn a rakusu, you have it written on the back. Right? It says, Dai Sai Ge Da Pu Ku, like that. And everybody's listening to this. And he sees that everyone has their robe folded on their head while they're chanting. And then they in this kind of solemn way, take it and start putting it on. And Dogen talks about this and he says he just started sobbing. In his entire experience of the tradition, of the larger Buddhist tradition, he had never experienced that kind of reverence. Up until then, I think what he's saying is, it was just his uniform. He was wearing what you're supposed to wear. And for the first time, he encountered this other feeling about it. That he could hold it in a different way, that he could meet it in a different way, that it could meet him in a different way. And it broke something open in him. So much so that it became a huge part of his teaching. And then became a huge part of the tradition. And as I've mentioned, at one point almost tore the whole tradition apart, because there was a split down the middle about the technical specifications of the robe and how it was to be sewn. And half of the temples said it was supposed to be one way, and half of the temples said it was the other way, and the government had to get involved. It's so embarrassing, but we're human beings. And some of those specifications were lost and then rediscovered in the last 100 years, so that I sew this robe in a way that is different from how it would have been sewn 150 years ago, 200 years ago, because there was a kind of stepping back and then a stepping toward. But we're talking about the virtue, the merit of the robe. And merit, as I've mentioned, is a kind of currency. It's something you can offer, right? You offer the merit. We offer it to all beings throughout space and time. Or we offer it to someone specific, or we offer it to a category of people. It's something that we treat like it's real, and then we give it away and give it away and give it away. So when we say there's merit to the Kesa, we're saying that it's imbued with something. And what I want to say to that is that that's true and it's not. And that understanding this point is to understand how this tradition works. An incredible amount of energy for centuries has been put into convincing us that we should hold this particular object in a particular way, that we should see it in a particular way, that it has a kind of magic. I'll share a story with you because this story is so important in the tradition. I've heard this story from so many people so many times. This is the story of the nun Utpalavarna. Okay. The nun Utpalavarna, in her career as a nun, accomplished the 6 miraculous powers and eventually became an arhat under the Buddha. But Nagarjuna told the story of the nun Utpalavarna and explains that originally she was an entertainer, which is a little bit of a euphemism. She was, usually when I hear this story, she's told to be a prostitute, but at least she works in that quarter, right? At one point in a past life, she was an entertainer, and in a kind of frivolous moment, she grabbed a nun's robe and put it on as a joke and danced around and said, "I'm a nun." And then she gave it back. But because, not of her virtue, but because she had touched this object, that because she had worn this object, even as a joke, she was reborn as someone who became a nun. In a later life, so originally she was born at the time of the Kashyapa Buddha, who was the Buddha previous to Shakyamuni Buddha. And then later lived at the time of Shakyamuni Buddha. And then this is an important part. It says, she broke the precepts many times over these lifetimes, but the virtue of putting on the robe one time was much more powerful than her unwholesome deeds. So it isn't that she put it on once and then suddenly she was this incredibly virtuous person. It was that over lifetimes, over eons, she continued to stray, she continued to make mistakes, but that having had contact with this robe, it made it sort of inevitable that she would eventually land in this other place. That's the power that is attributed to this piece of cloth. So why am I talking about this? It's not to tell you that if you touch this, then lifetimes from now, you'll be some great spiritual teacher. Maybe. I'm not going to say you won't, but that's not my understanding of this story or the way that we hold this. What I want to get across is this tradition in so many ways engages in play. around how we hold certain ideas. It holds up the robe specifically as a sacred object and says, treat this way. Figure out what it is to treat something as a sacred object. Before you put it on your head. Chant the thing that says, this is sacred. Approach it with humility. Only wash it in this way and this way and this way. Never put anything on top of it. Wear this one in this situation and this one in this situation. Right? Adopt this position of reverence to a piece of cloth. It is not that we're all pretending that the robe is sacred. It's that we're given a tool by which to understand what sacredness is. And if we learn to hold this with reverence, then we can learn to hold something else with reverence. But it's too much in the beginning. It's too much. We do this with Buddha. If the basic teaching of Buddhism, if the basic teaching of this tradition is that you should see everyone as spiritually whole, as truly spiritually complete, you might say, wow, that's a beautiful teaching. But then your head just explodes. You don't even know how to do that with yourself. So we start with this idea that there's a thing called a Buddha. There's a thing that is an enlightened being, and that's a very special kind of person. And that when we see that kind of person, not only a Buddha, but if we were to see an image of a Buddha, a statue of a Buddha, a painting of a Buddha, that we would bow. That we would treat that with reverence and we would meet it as a student. That we would empty our cups before that every single time. And then, slowly, we start to add this other piece, which says, you're Buddha. And it says, everybody's Buddha. And that everything is Buddha. And that actually Buddha is not just a special kind of person. But if you figured out how to relate to that, now you've figured out how to relate to the world. If you have figured out how to relate to the robe, you've figured out how to relate to the world. So we have these teachings on the robe, but we also have something like Tenzo Kyokun, which is the instructions to the cook, that describes the same kind of reverence, but now for carrots. It says that you should refer to vegetables and rice by their honorable names. You should treat them as sacred objects, and you should receive them into your body as sacred objects. And having done that, you should move as someone who has been fueled by pure sacredness. But if we start from there, I don't know. For me, it's too big a leap. But when I have practiced how to relate to something with reverence, to one thing with reverence, then I can turn to the next thing and say, what if I did the same thing here? What if I did the same thing again over here? And now I have a model and I have an understanding, not just for the behavior of it, but I can check myself. I say, am I really doing it? Because for whatever reason, this guy who was raised in a cowboy town in Montana with no exposure to Buddhism at all, when he sees one of these robes, he gets really open and he kind of freezes. There's something overwhelming about this to me. I've been in Japan in used shops before where I found them, where they were disposed of, and then they get buried among kimono or something, and you pull it out. And it's like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's such a mind stopper because you're rummaging through a stack of things and you're treating them as just things and you're looking for a deal. And then suddenly there's this thing in the middle of it. And you realize I was doing the whole thing wrong. Everything about that was wrong. Because here I am and I'm touching this thing in the same way that the nun Upalavarna touched it. By accident. It's the Buddha's robe. The actual one. So I want, if I can, to leave you all with this sense of how playful this tradition is. It's very smart. It's guiding us somewhere, but it's doing it as a kind of game where we imagine, what if this were like this? And we do that until we figure out how to make it real, and then how to make that real everywhere. That's what we've signed up for. It's fun. And that's where I'll stop.